you, Secretary Strait. And I'll go straight to a question from Ian. And his question is about Brexit. Can you give us some examples of how we've benefited in defence terms from Brexit?
Well, Brexit is interesting for defence because defence was never part of the main pillars of the EU. So there was, while there was often lots of sort of suggestions by sort of conspiracy theories that somehow we were all linked to a secret defence policy of the EU, there wasn't one. There was no EU army. There was no, the EU could never really agree single foreign policy in the first place to allow any armed forces to ever be deployed. There were a few defence missions. The EU, we were part of at one stage, the mission in the Mediterranean Sea, but they were mainly just an organisational sort of headquarters, and they are bilateral. In other words, you choose to join them or you don't choose. And because they weren't in the main pillar of the EU, it hasn't really affected us one way or the other. We were always free to do what we wanted to do with our defence. The only issue that we have to watch on the horizon is having left the EU, and not because we've left the EU, but it was always the direction of travel. The EU was looking at a more common defence fund for the purposes of research and procurement of equipment. And that is quite a large amount of money now. It's growing. And the EDF, the European Defence Fund, will be used to research and indeed potentially shape the development of European defence capabilities, which could see them being unilaterally or being the sole supplier within the EU market. That would not be good for our British defence contractors, but it is unlikely to get to the ambition of some of those people wanting to do that, because there are many other nations in Europe who like partnering with non-European countries on equipment. So the Typhoon is obviously an aircraft made between the British, the Spanish, the Italians, and the Germans, and there are many others. We're partnering with Italy and Sweden on FCAS, the next generation of fighter aircraft. And people like to mix and match. They like to have access to the United States market. And fundamentally on defence spending, what people forget is there aren't really many big customers in Europe. So if you wanted to pull up the drawbridge of you of the European Commission, you might be cutting off one of your biggest customers, that is the British defence, a government who spends nearly 15 to 16 billion pounds a year on defence procurement. So I don't think it's going to get as far as people hope, but nevertheless, there is an ambition in that space for some more centralised design of single types. But whether that materialises, I don't know.
Thank you very much. And the next question again is on Ukraine, and it's from Francesca. And the question is, how do you see the war in Ukraine being won, with Ukraine regaining full control of its country, and will it truly last as many years as many are now saying?
Well, Ukraine had so if you're Ukrainian, you've been at war with Russia since 2014. The West sort of just thought it was about an invasion and part of Ukraine in 2014 and Crimea, and everyone went home and everyone sat behind a border. In fact, the Ukrainians had 11,000 Ukrainians killed between the end of the 2014 incursion and February. It's 11,000 people. Imagine if we'd lost 11,000 people over whatever it was, 7 years. We'd think we're at war. So at one level, the Ukrainians have been living with crisis and conflict in a way that we can't imagine. So for them, defending their homeland is not time bound. It'll be something they will endure if they have to. But in this occasion, Russia has bitten off more than it can chew. It has suffered catastrophic levels of loss. It has destroyed lots of property, killed many, many people, and in the long run, Putin has also lost the international reputation of Russia. Russia is a lesser country than it was before it did this, both in reputation and in economic power and actually in military might. So overall, I think it is in a position where Russia is weakening in Ukraine, but there is a difference. It might be weakening, but it is a country that doesn't seem to care, or leadership cares about its own people, never mind the people it's trying to conquer. So this is the challenge for the West, is we cannot let Putin's brutality to the Ukrainians and indeed his own people win over our and the Ukrainians' values that they hold dear as a nation, which is very much Western European values of human rights and freedom. And so that's why it's so important we continue to support Ukraine. I think right now it is possible that in the next few months, Ukraine could effectively break part of the Russian army. It could certainly push them back from many parts. I'm not sure whether they could push them back or would in Crimea. They could do. When armies collapse, as we saw even in Afghanistan not so long ago, they can collapse very quickly. And in history, it will show you can suddenly become a rout, as they call it in the army, because a withdrawal becomes a rout. But on the other hand, Russia could start digging in, just not really caring how much death it causes to its own people, and then present that as a victory, and then try and hide behind a fortified front line. That's why it's important we give the Ukrainians the weapons to get them out of those holes and out of their lines. And that's why the GMLRS, the multi-launch rocket system with HIMARS, the British have supplied them now alongside the United States, who provided them first. And I think if we start to do that, and the Ukrainians start to prepare, they will have the ability to push back the Russians. Whether they'll be able to push them entirely out of the country, I think will depend on how the Russians respond to being attacked rather than when the Ukrainians are in defense. And secondly, how much weapons the Russians have left. The Russians have fired off a lot of their sophisticated weapon systems, leaving them with not very many. And now they're taking out of 1950s stock and 60s stock weapon systems. And that's why they don't work very well.
As you can imagine, we've got quite a few questions on Ukraine, and the next one is from Elizabeth. Can you tell us more about the work we have done to train Ukrainian forces?
Yeah, so way back in 2015, we set up Orbital. There were a number of countries that responded to Crimea invasion by saying, we will help Ukraine help itself. Britain, Canada, Sweden, and the United States were the main ones I remember. And we have trained 20,000, the British have trained 20,000 personnel. We were also what was called the Navy Framework Nation, helping them set up their Navy. Since then, and as the conflict approached, or the war approached, we put in the new Ranger Regiment, which was one of the ones from the defence reforms, to teach them on NLAWs and put in the lethal aid. And that's what you're seeing now. Also seeing Ukrainians that we have trained on the new weapon systems we put in. So as they got more sophisticated, we put in anti-air missiles, the very short range, high velocity and low velocity missile. That's gone in. And also we're going to put in the long range artillery, GMRS. At the same time, we've offered to the Ukrainians to train, basic training of people into the service, I think about 10,000 a month. And we are starting that this week. So our job is sometimes moving away from providing hardware to moving to the software, in other words, our know-how. And if you can combine that all together and then use the NATO weapons that we're providing, the NATO standard weapons we're providing from the West, then I think we have a good chance.